You ever come home after months away, finally stepping onto your own land, only to find someone else acting like they own it more than you? Yeah, that happened to me. I'm talking about the kind of neighbor that gives Karen a bad name X. This wasn't just a snide comment at a HOA meeting. This was full-blown, calling the cops level drama. And it happened the second I returned to my ranch. Picture this. Dust still on my boots from an 80-month deployment. The smell of the desert. Clinging to my clothes, my duffel bag still sitting in the back of my pickup. I roll up the driveway of my family's ranch, the same ranch my family has cared for since the early 1950s. Every corner of that land tells a story. Every fence post, every tree, every stone is soaked in decades of sweat, hope, and pride. And just as I'm about to breathe in that sweet, familiar air, I see her. Her posture was something out of a bad sitcom. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed, that trademark "you don't belong here" scowl plastered across her face. The HOA Karen. And she wasn't alone, her little posse of rulebook fanatics lurking in the background, probably imagining themselves as law enforcement. And then it happened. The call. The cops, yes, real life, law enforcement, summoned because I dared to step foot on the land that legally had been mine longer than she'd been alive. My heart sank, not because I feared the law, but because I knew exactly what kind of nightmare bureaucratic power trips could become. And here's the kicker. 5 minutes later, everything she thought she had control over vanished. The HOA she had leaned on like armor, the rules she wielded like a sword. Gone, dissolved. Legally, irrevocably. But let me back up and tell you how we got here, because this isn't just a story about confrontation. It's about legacy, legality, and the kind of justice that doesn't come from anger. It comes from knowing your rights and standing your ground before all the chaos. Life at the ranch was quiet, almost poetic in its stillness. The wind whispered through the tall grass, the cattle grazed lazily in the fields, and the sun would set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, so vivid they almost didn't seem real. This ranch was more than property. It was home. It was a testament to generations, a living archive of family stories, celebrations, hardships, and triumphs. And then came the HOA. When we first moved here, the HOA seemed harmless. A neighborhood association meant to maintain some order, maybe ensure fences stayed up and lawns were mowed. But what started as community guidelines soon spiraled into a tool for control. Wielded by people who had no connection to the land, no respect for history, and certainly no sense of common decency. HOAs can feel like a mini government, and some of them love the taste of authority. They create rules about everything: paint colors, mailbox styles, even whether you can hang a hammock in your yard. Most of the time, they operate quietly behind the scenes. But when someone like Karen gets hold of them, well, it's a recipe for drama. She had always been the type to hover, to nitpick, to micromanage. I had heard rumors from neighbors over the years, small confrontations, letters sent, a few fines here and there, but nothing prepared me for what would happen the day I returned. After 18 months away, my return should have been a celebration. My boots hit the gravel of the driveway, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For months, I had been in deserts, mountains, and bases across the world, always moving. Always away from the people I loved, away from the place that was mine. And finally, I was home. And then I saw her, Karen, standing there like a general on her parade ground. Clipboard in hand, eyes sharp, scanning me up and down as if to decide if I was worthy of breathing the same air as her HOA rules allowed. And suddenly, in that serene moment, the tension cracked. She called the cops. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why call the cops on someone returning to their own property? But that's exactly the power some people feel when they lean on bureaucracy. She probably imagined herself a hero of rules, enforcing invisible laws that only existed because she said so. While I waited, dust still settling from my truck tires, my mind raced. I could feel the years of history on that land pressing down on me. Every fence post my grandfather hammered in, every tree my father planted, every corner of this ranch screamed my right to be here. And I knew I wasn't going to let this slide, and here's where it gets cinematic. Because while she thought she was controlling the scene, while she imagined herself the ultimate authority, the truth was already in motion. 5 minutes. After that phone call, the HOA that she had built her entire sense of power on was legally dissolved. Let that sink in. 5 minutes. That stack of bylaws, rules, and fines that had been her shield, gone legally. You're probably wondering,
How?
how could something so entrenched, so seemingly untouchable, vanish in the blink of an eye? The answer is a mix of legal knowledge, preparation, and a history of overlooked loopholes. And this is the part most people never see. Because in life, sometimes the people who think they hold the power don't. Sometimes the system favors those who understand it, those who respect its rules, and those who never let their emotion cloud their strategy. The moment the cops arrived, everything slowed down. You know that feeling when time stretches? Each second heavier than the last, and the air itself feels thicker. That's exactly what it was like. I could hear the crunch of gravel under their boots before. I even saw the patrol cars pull up. Karen's expression didn't change. She was standing there, arms crossed, like she had rehearsed this scene 1,000 times. But here's the thing. She was about to learn that rehearsals don't always translate into reality. One of the officers stepped out and walked towards us. He was calm, professional, but there was an unmistakable flicker of surprise when he saw me. He took in the dust on my boots, the military duffel in the back of my truck, the way I stood squarely on my own property. And just like that, the energy shifted. "Sir," he said politely, "we received a call about a possible trespassing incident. Can you tell me what's happening?" I kept my voice steady, measured, because in situations like this, tone is everything, officer. This is my family's ranch. I've been away on deployment for 18 months. I'm just returning home. I have every right to be here. The officer nodded slowly, pulling out a small notepad. "Do you have proof of ownership?" Handed over the property DU-load edges from years of handling, stamped and notarized, unmistakably ours. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like she was searching for the right words. But words weren't going to save her. Not here. Not today. The moment of power shift, it was almost cinematic. The way authority can shift in an instant. Karen had leaned on the HOA like armor. That little book of rules and fines, the imaginary power she wielded over the neighborhood, was what made her feel untouchable. But in the face of legal proof, all that armor crumbled. The officer looked at Karen and then back at me. "Ma'am, the property deed clearly shows that this is the resident's land. There's no trespassing here. You can't compel someone off their own property without a court order." Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of panic crossing her face. I could almost hear the mental gears turning, trying to find some loophole, some technicality, some way to regain control. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. And that's when I got the call I had been waiting for. My attorney on speaker.com and precise. The HOA bylaws have a critical flaw in their formation. Because of this, they're legally dissolved. It's effective immediately. I didn't even need to hide my smirk. 5 minutes after the call, the organization she had leaned on for control gone. Legally dissolved. Not a rumor, not a threat gone. Karen's face paled. This was a different kind of power than she had ever known. Her rules, her fines, her authority. All of it was suddenly meaningless. She looked at the cops, then at me, then back at the empty air where the HOA's power should have been. Reactions and drama, the tension was palpable. You could feel the air crackle as she tried to maintain her composure. She opened her mouth, probably expecting to lecture me, to threaten me with fines, lawsuits, or some imagined authority. But there was nothing left. She had nothing. I took a step closer, not aggressive, just deliberate. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "this land belongs to my family. The HOA rules you were using to threaten me are dissolved. The law is clear. I'm home, and I plan to stay." For a moment, the only sound was the wind rustling through the ranch grass and the soft hum of the police car engine. Karen's shoulders slumped slightly in, almost imperceptible surrender, but I saw it. She had lost. One of the officers cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Ma'am, you need to step back and understand that these bylaws no longer have legal standing. Any further attempts to enforce them could be considered harassment." It was like watching a slow-motion collapse. Everything she had built her. Identity on her authority. Her reputation as the enforcer of HOA rules was evaporating before her eyes. Flashback now. You might be wondering, how did it happen so fast? How could an entire HOA, a system of rules, fines, and committees, dissolve in 5 minutes? Here's the key: preparation and knowledge. Months before my deployment ended, my family and I had discovered critical errors in the HOA's formation documents. The bylaws were incomplete, some signatures were invalid, and the filing had never complied with state regulations. Most people would ignore it. They'd assume the HOA was untouchable. But we had legal counsel and had everything meticulously documented. So when Karen thought she could wield her rulebook like a sword, she was already walking on sand. Every step she took was unstable because the foundation was weak. And when the officer confirmed the property deed, when the legal dissolution took effect, that foundation crumbled instantly. It's a lesson. Authority built on ignorance or oversight is fragile. Power can vanish in a moment if it isn't grounded in law, reason, or truth. Here's the cinematic part. The wind picks up. The sun dips just enough to cast long shadows across the ranch. I step forward, boots crunching on the gravel. And there's a sense of poetic justice in the air. Karen turns to leave. Her little posse trailing behind, muttering, probably trying to save face. But it's too late. The moment is mine. The ranch is mine. The history, the legacy, the sweat and love poured into this land. Untouchable, and the cops. They pack up, politely nod, and leave. Probably a little stunned at the surreal intensity of the situation they just witnessed. I stand there for a moment, alone. The wind carries the sound of the cattle, the rustle of grass, the distant call of birds. Silence, but not empty. It's alive. This ranch has seen a lot over the decades, but today it witnessed a rare kind of justice. Quiet, legal, undeniable. It's not just about winning against a Karen with too much time and too little perspective. It's about understanding your rights, preparing and having the patience to let the law work in your favor. It's about standing up, not with aggression, but with certainty. And let's be honest, there's an emotional satisfaction in watching entitlement crumble. When someone tries to leverage power they don't truly have, and it collapses instantly. It's a mix of relief, vindication, and yes, a little cinematic joy. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't bitterness. It was validation. Validation that knowledge is more powerful than bluster. That preparation outweighs intimidation, and that history and legality trump arbitrary authority. After the cops left and the HOA bylaws were officially dissolved, a strange quiet settled over the ranch. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wind through the grass or the cattle grazing in the distance. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm when tension has broken, and the world seems to pause to catch its breath. I stood on the porch, looking out over the land my family had fought so hard to protect. For years, neighbors had whispered about the power of the HOA, about how even longtime residents had to follow its rules or risk fines and harassment. But today, all of that changed. Word spreads fast in small communities, especially in rural neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone, or at least thinks they do. By the time I was back inside, curious glances and murmurs were already floating across the property lines. People had seen Karen's confrontation. They had seen the cops, and most importantly, they had heard that the HOA's power was gone. Some neighbors cautiously approached, eyes wide, but smiling. One older couple, who had been quietly resisting some of the stricter HOA rules for years, came up to me. "You didn't just come home," the husband said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You came back and well, you set a precedent." I nodded, feeling the weight of history and responsibility. "This isn't about me," I said. "It's about all of us who live here, who care about this land. It's about knowing your rights and protecting your home." Others were less polite, whispering behind hedges and across fences. Karen's reputation had always been inflated by fear and intimidation. But with the HOA dissolved, people could finally see her for what she was. A bully who relied on rules she didn't even fully understand. There's something fascinating about watching the social dynamics of a small community shift in real time. Fear, respect, and authority are like fragile glass. They shatter when pressure is applied. And for the first time in years, the glass shattered in our favor. Karen's attempts to fight back didn't leave quietly. That wasn't her style. Over the next few days, she tried everything she could think of to regain her power. Letters, meetings, phone calls. She tried to paint me as an aggressor, someone who had taken advantage of the HOA's dissolution. But without legal standing, her threats were hollow. I'll never forget the day she tried to call a neighborhood meeting. She stood at the community center, clutching a stack of papers, eyes darting nervously around the room. But as soon as someone mentioned the court documents and the legal dissolution, the room went silent. Then, slowly, one by one, people began to leave. She was talking to an empty room. Literally no one left to enforce her rules or validate her authority. It was poetic justice in slow motion. All the power she thought she had was tied to a paper structure that no longer existed. And every attempt to regain control only reminded everyone just how powerless she had become. Standing back on my ranch, watching the dust settle after all this drama, I realized something important. This wasn't just about a Karen, an HOA, or even a ranch. It was about understanding power, authority, the tools people use to try to control others. There's a lesson here for anyone who's ever felt overwhelmed by bureaucracy or entitlement. Don't panic, don't react emotionally, and most importantly, know your rights. Knowledge is the ultimate power. The rules that people try to impose on you only have authority if you let them. And sometimes, justice isn't about confrontation. It's about patience, preparation, and letting the land history do the heavy lifting for you. I remember sitting on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. My dog lay at my feet, tired from running through the open fields. And in that moment, it struck me how personal this victory really was. This ranch wasn't just land. It wasn't just property. It was memory, identity, and legacy. Every person who lives on land with a family history knows this feeling. The sense that the earth beneath your feet carries stories that deserve respect. And for too long, Karen and her HOA had tried to rewrite those stories with their rules. But the truth can't be erased. History can't be rewritten. And sometimes, all it takes is the right moment, the right preparation, and a little bit of legal finesse to remind people of that truth. Over the next few weeks, life returned to its natural rhythm. The wind blew, the cattle grazed, and the ranch became what it always was, a place of peace, hard work, and legacy. But the memory of that confrontation lingered. Karen never truly recovered her aura of authority. People who once feared her quietly went about their lives, free from fines, letters, and arbitrary rules. She tried to keep up appearances, but everyone knew the game was over. And for me, finally understood what it felt like to protect something bigger than myself. This wasn't just about returning home or proving a point. It was about standing up for the truth, for my family, and for the community that deserved freedom from arbitrary control. Here's the cinematic truth of it all. The most powerful victories are often the quietest. The ones that don't involve shouting, anger, or destruction. The ones that come from preparation, patience, and understanding. Karen called the cops, thinking she had the upper hand. She thought the rules were on her side. But rules without legality, power without foundation, they crumble. 5 minutes was all it took to dissolve a structure she believed was untouchable. And in those 5 minutes, history reminded her and everyone watching that authority is meaningless without truth, knowledge, and legality backing it up. The next morning, the ranch felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The air was fresher, the sun warmer, and every sound seemed sharper: the clatter of a gate, the lowing of cattle, the distant hum of a tractor. It was as if the land itself was celebrating a victory long overdue. Word about the HOA's dissolution had already spread. By noon, I started noticing subtle shifts in the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Karen and her rules now walked with a new kind of confidence. Children played freely in yards that had once been regulated, and fences that had been dictated by the HOA's arbitrary standards began to reflect personal choice again. It was fascinating to watch. Some residents approached me with hesitant smiles, almost as if they couldn't believe this freedom had finally arrived. Others were more exuberant, sharing stories of little acts of defiance they had quietly carried out for years. Now emboldened by the collapse of Karen's authority. Finally, one neighbor whispered, "We can just live without fear of fines." And in that simple word, freedom, you could hear the collective weight of years lifting from their shoulders. But Karen, of course, didn't accept her defeat quietly. Over the following days, she tried increasingly desperate measures. She emailed, she texted, she posted notices in community forums, insisting the HOA still existed, that fines were enforceable, that rules were still in effect. People laughed. Some ignored her. A few confronted her politely, showing the legal documents proving the HOA's dissolution. Each attempt she made to regain control only emphasized her loss of credibility. It was almost theatrical. Here she was, storming from one end of the neighborhood to another, wielding a stack of outdated papers like a sword, while the community collectively realized she no longer held any power. And through it all, I stayed calm. Because my victory wasn't just legal, it was social. Authority, when it's illegitimate, collapses under the weight of truth. And once the truth was visible to everyone, Karen was powerless. Something remarkable began to happen. People who had once stayed quiet, fearful of the HOA's reach, started standing up for themselves. A homeowner began repainting their fence in a bold color she had been forbidden to use. Another planted a garden in their front yard, defying rules about uniform landscaping. It was as if one person's courage, the courage to stand firm, armed with knowledge and legality, had sparked a chain reaction. Fear no longer dictated behavior. Freedom, respect, and common sense did. I watched this unfold from the porch of my ranch, feeling a mix of pride and relief. The ranch had always been a place of history, but now it was a symbol of resilience. A victory for me. Yes, but more importantly, a victory for the entire neighborhood. A week later, I walked the property lines, boots crunching on the gravel, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the fields. The ranch was quiet, but in that quiet, there was a profound sense of justice. Not the kind of loud, vengeful justice you see in movies, but the kind that resonates in the heart, where right and law align. And those who overstepped finally faced the consequences of their actions. I paused at the edge of the property, looking at the horizon. This was more than a personal win. It was proof that preparation, patience, and knowledge are stronger than arrogance and entitlement. 5 minutes had been all it took to dissolve decades of illegitimate power. 5 minutes. But the lessons would last a lifetime. Karen's last attempts to fight back were almost tragicamic. She tried to call emergency meetings, gathered signatures from a handful of loyalists, and even attempted to sue for defamation, claiming that my actions had destroyed her reputation. But the evidence was clear. The HOA had been legally dissolved. The rules she clung to were unenforceable, and the community, they were no longer listening. Every move she made seemed to push her further into isolation. By the end of the month, she had retreated from public life. Her authority completely eroded, her power nothing more than a cautionary tale. And the neighborhood is thriving, free, and united. Here's the thing about stories like this: they're about more than drama or confrontation. They're about understanding the dynamics of power and how it can be challenged effectively. First, knowledge is the ultimate weapon. Karen relied on intimidation, fear, and ignorance. I relied on facts, history, and legal documentation. When preparation meets opportunity, authority built on fear crumbles. Second, patience and composure matter more than anger. It would have been easy to yell, to escalate, to respond emotionally, but that never works. Calm, informed action always wins over bluster. And finally, community is stronger when people stand together. One person can spark change, but the ripple effects grow when the entire neighborhood realizes the rules. They were following blindly, are meaningless without legitimacy, as the sun set behind the ranch, painting the sky with shades of fire and gold. I reflected on everything that had happened. This story wasn't just about a return home, an overzealous HOA member, or a dramatic 5-minute victory. It was about legacy, justice, and the quiet, undeniable power of truth. The ranch would continue to thrive. The neighborhood would continue to flourish, and Karen, well, her attempts to control others had finally been exposed as empty. And in that moment, I realized that the most satisfying victories are often the ones that happen quietly, legally, and with the kind of cinematic resonance that doesn't need explosions, shouting, or drama. Because some of the most unforgettable moments in life are built on principle, patience, and preparation. The days after the HOA's dissolution settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal. The ranch, my home, felt alive in a way that no one bureaucracy could ever suppress. The air smelled sweeter, the cattle moved more freely, and even the wind seemed to whisper, "Justice has been served." But the real drama wasn't in the land itself, it was in the way life finally recalibrated for the people around me. The neighborhood, once quiet with fear, was now vibrant with energy. People smiled more openly. They greeted each other without hesitation. And there was a newfound sense of empowerment in the air. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. One evening, a small gathering formed spontaneously at my ranch. Not a party, not a celebration of me, but a celebration of freedom, the freedom from arbitrary control. Neighbors brought food, drinks, stories, and laughter. Children ran through the open fields without hesitation, chasing the shadows of the late afternoon sun. I watched from the porch, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. The ranch wasn't just mine anymore, had become a symbol of what happens when courage, preparation, and knowledge meet injustice head-on. People shared stories about their own struggles with the HOA, the fines they avoided, the rules they quietly resisted. And now, all of those struggles felt validated, acknowledged, and overcome. Karen, of course, didn't attend. She lingered at the edges, posting her complaints online, trying to salvage her sense of authority, but the community no longer listened. Her power had evaporated. The real cinematic moment came one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. I walked along the property line, boots crunching on gravel, and thought about everything that had happened. The cops, the confrontation, the dissolution of the HOA all seemed surreal. 5 minutes had changed everything. A structure that had seemed untouchable, rules that had intimidated and oppressed collapsed in a blink. And it wasn't anger or vengeance that had caused it. It was calm, preparation, and legal knowledge. That's the key takeaway. Power without legitimacy is fleeting. Authority built on fear, rules, or arrogance will always crumble when confronted. With truth and preparation, and sometimes justice doesn't need shouting or chaos, it simply needs patience, strategy, and courage. Karen's last attempts to regain control were almost comical in retrospect. She tried meetings with empty chairs, emails to residents who had already moved on, and online posts that no one took seriously. Every attempt only reinforced her lack of authority. The community had seen the truth, and truth has a way of cementing itself. The rules she once wielded like weapons had become meaningless paper. The fines she had threatened to levy were unenforceable. The fear she had cultivated evaporated completely, and in that there was a subtle justice more satisfying than any confrontation could ever provide. Quiet, legal, and undeniable. Standing on the porch, watching the sky turn indigo, I realized that this story was about more than a ranch, a HOA, or one entitled neighbor. It was about legacy, the legacy of respecting land, history, and the people who care for it. It was about knowing your rights and understanding that legality and preparation are far more powerful than intimidation, and it was about community. Once the fear was gone, the neighborhood thrived. People started expressing themselves, making small changes, reclaiming their freedom. The ripple effect of one legal victory transformed the entire environment. This is the real lesson. Authority has limits. Entitlement is fragile. And preparation, patience, and knowledge are stronger than any rulebook or rule enforcer. If I close my eyes and replay those moments, it feels like a scene from a movie. The dust on my boots, the cops standing respectfully, Karen's panicked expressions, the community watching silently. The legal papers dissolving the HOA in 5 minutes, all of it cinematic, all of it emotionally satisfying. It wasn't flashy. There were no dramatic car chases, no explosions, no shouting matches. It was real life. And sometimes, reality is far more gripping than fiction. Because this was justice, served calmly, efficiently, and finally, after the HOA dissolved, life didn't just return to normal. It began to sparkle in small, beautiful ways that most people would never notice on the surface. For example, there was Mr. Jensen, an elderly neighbor who had spent years quietly repainting fences and hedges, always checking over his shoulder to avoid fines. On the morning after the HOA was dissolved, he rolled out of his garage with a massive neon orange mailbox. Not a subtle color by any means, just bold, unapologetic, and cheerful. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off my porch. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about expression. It was about people finally realizing that the arbitrary rules had never defined them. And there were countless small stories like this. A young couple planting sunflowers in their front yard where they had once been told only uniform grass was allowed. Kids setting up an impromptu lemonade stand on the street corner without filing paperwork or paying imaginary fees. These little acts were almost cinematic, in their own way, a subtle, joyful rebellion. It wasn't about anger or confrontation. It was about reclaiming joy and freedom. And that's what made this story more than just a confrontation. It was a masterclass in understanding power. Karen had believed she held all the cards. She thought rules equaled authority, fines equaled control, and fear equaled respect. But all of that fell apart when someone knew their rights. Think about it like this. Authority without legitimacy is like a house built on sand. It looks strong until the tide comes in. The rules Karen relied on were the sand, and my preparation, the legal documents, the deed, the attorney's validation was the tide. It doesn't crash in dramatically, but it erodes everything that isn't anchored in truth. And in 5 minutes, the tide swept her so-called power away. It's a lesson we can all carry with us. When faced with bureaucracy, entitlement, or someone trying to control you, preparation and knowledge are far more powerful than fear or aggression. Of course, no story like this is complete without moments of subtle humor. I'll never forget the day Karen tried to inspect my newly built fence, clipboard in hand, squinting as if measuring every plank with the intensity of a NASA engineer. I walked up to her, calmly pointed at the deed, and said, "Funny thing about property lines, this one's mine." She blinked, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off. My dog, who had been napping nearby, looked at me like I'd just won $1 million lottery. It was one of those perfect cinematic moments, quiet, ridiculous, and completely satisfying. Even in small towns, comedy and justice often coexist. And in this story, those tiny moments made the narrative richer, more human, and relatable. People watching this could see themselves in Mr. Jensen, the young couple, the kids, or even in the ridiculousness of Karen's obsession. If this story teaches anything, it's that life is a lot like managing land. You can plant, water, and nurture, but only if you understand the rules of nature. Arbitrary restrictions from people with no real authority are like weeds, they'll try to choke growth. But if you know what you're doing, you can remove them and flourish. Karen represented those weeds, persistent, intrusive, and determined to control everything. But weeds can't survive in fertile, well-prepared soil. Knowledge, patience, and legal awareness were the fertilizer and sunlight that allowed freedom to grow. And the beauty is, once the weeds are gone, life spreads in unexpected ways. People start expressing themselves, creating, sharing, and thriving. That's exactly what happened after the HOA dissolved. The neighborhood bloomed. Imagine this scene. The ranch at sunset, a golden-orange sky stretching endlessly, casting shadows across the rolling fields. Neighbors walk along dirt paths, kids chase chickens. A pickup truck drives by with music playing, the wind rustling through the tall grass. Every moment is cinematic, every detail vibrant. Then imagine Karen, standing alone at the edge of the neighborhood, waving her clipboard desperately, ignored by everyone. It's almost like a slow-motion movie, seeing the antagonist fading as the world moves forward without them. And in contrast, my family walks through the ranch, boots crunching on gravel, feeling the legacy of decades under our feet. The camera might not exist, but the mental imagery is cinematic enough to keep anyone watching glued to the story. It's victory without theatrics, justice without chaos, but incredibly satisfying. What makes this story so compelling isn't just drama, it's emotion. Anyone who has ever returned home after a long absence, anyone who has felt their hard work or legacy threatened, can relate to the fear, frustration, and eventual triumph. There is a universal human satisfaction in watching entitlement crumble, especially when it's done legally and peacefully. It reassures us that preparation, patience, and standing your ground can overcome arrogance and intimidation. And for me, personally, every sunset over the ranch, every smile from neighbors, every neon orange mailbox reinforced the truth. Standing firm and knowing your rights isn't just practicalized transformative. The days turned into weeks, and the ranch slowly settled into its new reality. But this wasn't the quiet, empty calm of surrender. It was the vibrant hum of a neighborhood rediscovering its freedom. People no longer tiptoed around invisible rules or cowered under threats of fines. They smiled. They spoke openly. They lived. The change was subtle, almost cinematic in its poetry. Mr. Jensen painted his fences neon orange. Children laughed without fear. The couple down the street planted their sunflowers proudly. Every small act was a brushstroke on a canvas of liberation. The HOA, once a looming specter over our lives, was gone. Its queen, Karen, had faded into irrelevance. It was a quiet revolution, but it felt monumental. Even Karen's last attempts to salvage her power were comically pathetic. She tried one last town meeting, waving outdated papers and lecturing about rules that didn't exist. But nobody came, not a single person. I watched from my porch as she stood alone at the podium, clipboard, trembling, shouting into empty chairs. The wind carried her words away. The neighborhood had moved on, leaving her isolated in her own fantasy of control. It was cinematic justice at its finest. No violence, no shouting matches, no chaos. Just the natural, undeniable collapse of authority built on arrogance and entitlement. What happened next was beautiful in its subtlety. Neighbors began helping each other in ways they had avoided for years. Unsure if the HOA would frown upon collaboration, tools were borrowed freely, fences were mended together. And for the first time in decades, the community felt like a family. One afternoon, as I walked the property line, I noticed a group of kids painting murals on the side of an old barn, a spontaneous act of joy and creativity. Their laughter echoed across the fields, blending with the rustle of the wind through the grass. It struck me then that this was the true victory. Not the legal dissolution, not even the humiliation of Karen, but the sense of liberation, empowerment, and community restored. The ranch and the neighborhood had become a living testament to courage, preparation, and knowledge. If there's one thing this story proves, it's that knowledge is power in its purest form. Karen had rules. She had fines. She had intimidation. But she lacked legitimacy and preparation. In contrast, armed with deeds, legal counsel, and patience, I didn't just return home my reclaimed history, legacy, and respect. Authority, when unsupported by truth, collapses. Entitlement, when unchallenged, can seem insurmountable. But preparation, patience, and calm determination can topple even the most confident oppressors. And that is a lesson that goes far beyond HOAs or land disputes. It applies to life, work, and every interaction where someone tries to control you unfairly. Picture this scene. The ranch bathed in the golden-orange glow of sunset. Cattle graze lazily. Children's laughter echoes across the fields, and the wind dances through the tall grass. The camera pans slowly over the land, capturing every fence post, every tree, every stone that holds decades of family legacy. Then zoom in on me standing on the porch, boots dusty, shoulders squared, watching the horizon. There's a profound silence, but it's alive, a silence filled with triumph, justice, and restoration. Karen is nowhere to be seen. Her clipboard, abandoned in the wind. The rules she wielded like weapons are gone. What remains is truth, legacy, and the quiet power of law and knowledge. It's cinematic because it doesn't need explosions. It doesn't need dramatic music. Reality itself provides the drama. And for anyone watching, it's a visual metaphor for justice, patience, and resilience. Final human lessons, emotional payoff, returning to my ranch and witnessing this transformation, taught me more than any legal battle could. I learned that preparation beats intimidation every time. Patience allows the law to do its work. Knowledge empowers ordinary people to challenge extraordinary arrogance. Community thrives when fear is removed. And most importantly, I learned that true victories are often quiet. They don't need spectacle. They don't need vengeance. They simply need truth, patience, and courage. The neighborhood, once fearful and constrained, now thrives. People speak openly, act creatively, and help each other without hesitation. The ranch, standing as a testament to decades of family legacy, has become more than a home. It's a symbol of justice, resilience, and empowerment. The final scene is simple, yet unforgettable. The sun dips below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the ranch. The wind rustles the tall grass. Children laugh in the distance. Cattle graze peacefully. And I stand on the porch, watching it all. Boots dusty, heart full, knowing that legacy, truth, and preparation have triumphed. No shouting, no violence, no dramatics. Just life, restored and thriving. Karen fades into the background of memory, cautionary tale of arrogance and entitlement. The community flourishes, the ranch endures, and the lessons remain clear. Authority without legitimacy is nothing. Knowledge is power, and sometimes 5 minutes is all it takes to set things right. So, for anyone watching, never underestimate the power of preparation and knowledge. Don't be intimidated by rules that aren't backed by truth. Stand firm, stay calm, and let legality and history guide you. And remember, victories don't need to be loud to be unforgettable. Sometimes they're the quiet cinematic moments where the wind blows across the grass, the sun sets in perfect color, and justice quietly takes its rightful place.